Well, good afternoon, and welcome back to
American Heritage, one of the best shows in the history of mankind.
I love it. My name is Ed Bonderenka, and I am
a white Christian cisgender male.
And produces this show is the guy that answers the phones, warns me commercials are coming. He tells me,
"Hey Ed, your microphone's not on."
And that's Derek Stone, the Swiss Army knife of radio, and he's the host of
Stone Cold Sports Truth.
Right after, well, it comes on Sundays at noon 30, right after my friend Sean Todd hosts The Intersection at noon. The Intersection is
not your normal fluffy Christian show.
Not by a long shot. So listen to Abolish Roundtable at 9 on Saturdays and Trigger Talk at 11 on Saturdays. This show at 1 on Saturdays, and for calming cultural influence. Stay tuned to my friend Ed Hoffman and Speaking of Art right after this show at 3 p.m. In fact, like Dick Kupke of Trigger Talk says,
just take your knobs off your radio. Leave it right on Wham Radio.
Yeah, Your American Heritage is on Spotify, Apple Podcasts, Google Music. You should subscribe. Boost the signal, be Paul Revere, and get the word out. To find a link to the podcast to share it, go to whamradio.com, WAAM radio.com. Click on the podcast tab at the top. You know, there's a war going on for control of America. And what's a patriot supposed to do? Get organized. You know, the colonists did it in church. You should too. And we go to court. We educate our neighbors, and we support those who take the battle to the enemy, all right? And we support those who are running for office that support godly values, and then we make sure they do, and we encourage each other. That's half of what this show's about, is encouraging ourselves, and we arm ourselves intellectually. We learn the facts for ourselves so we can make wise decisions and explain them to others, and we arm ourselves physically. Get a gun, learn to use it, be prepared to defend yourself, your family, and your nation. And practice, practice, practice. And we arm ourselves spiritually. Once again, find a good church, read your Bible, join with others in prayer for our nation. Sort of like George Washington did. I now make it my earnest prayer that God would have the United States in his holy protection, that he would incline the hearts of the citizens to cultivate a spirit of subordination and obedience to government, to entertain a brotherly affection and love for one another, for their fellow citizens of the United States at large, and particularly for their brethren who have served in the field. And finally, that he would most graciously be pleased to dispose us all to do justice, to love mercy, and to demean ourselves with that charity, humility, and pacific temperament of mind, which were the characteristics of the divine author of our blessed religion, and without an humble imitation of whose example in these things we can never hope to be a happy nation. Amen. I'd also like to add, in addition, I want to pray that our Supreme Court would wisely decide on some upcoming decisions, particularly on birthplace citizenship. Father, please move on the hearts of the justices that they would protect our nation from the onslaught of immigrants seeking to twist the good nature of our citizens to their own purposes. Amen. Well, joining me today is Professor Wilfred McClay of Hillsdale College. He's the Victor Davis Hanson Chair in Classical History and Western Civilization. He's also the author of Land of Hope, and also the children's edition of that book. And in it he says, would a serious country so completely lose perspective on its own past that it would entertain the idea that the nation was founded on slavery rather than on the ideals that have made it a beacon to the rest of the world? We need to become a serious country again. And to do that, we need to believe in ourselves again. Believe in the reason we have been placed here as a land of hope for a world that needs hope more than ever. From the book by Wilfred McClay, Land of Hope, and silly me, I should have had him read it himself in his own voice, but I didn't. Well, last July...
Oh, you did it so well.
Oh,
you did it
thank
so
you.
well.
Thank you. And that voice is Bill. And last July, Bill was here, and we talked about another book that he's an editor of and a contributor to, along with Rabbi Stuart Halpern, and that's Jewish Roots of American Liberty, the impact of Hebraic ideas on the American story. And that's still an important topic. Then, before that, 2 years ago in June, we talked about the need to educate in matters of civics, among other things. You know, it's got to be an annual thing, and it's got to go to semi-annual at least. Welcome back, Bill.
Oh, at least. Thank you. It's wonderful to be back with you. It's like a breath of fresh air listening to your intro. I really enjoyed that.
Well, thank you.
Uplifted by it.
Thank you.
I'll try not to get down and dirty in this conversation because you lifted my eyes to the heights.
Wow.
Yeah.
All I was doing was quoting Washington.
I'm right there with you.
Excellent. Well, I was quoting Washington, and Peter from Hillsdale, the publicist for you guys, he contacted me and said, you'd like to come on and talk about Washington. And I said, man, what a blessing to have Wilfred McClay, professor of Hillsdale, the Victor Davis Hanson chair, actually say he would like to come on my show and talk about George Washington. Wonderful.
I like to talk about Washington any chance I get. He is somebody. I mean, I've been studying American history for many years, and he is one person that every year or every time I think about him, my esteem for him has risen because my appreciation of what he had to do, of the complexity, particularly in the Revolution, the complexity of the job he faced. So I'm happy to talk about him. You know, we're about to celebrate the 250th anniversary it's actually the 250th anniversary of the Declaration of Independence, you know, the document that we mainly think of Thomas Jefferson writing, although he did have some help from the committee. It's one time when a committee produced something better than the single author. You know, it's one of those few occasions. But John Adams had some good contributions, Ben Franklin. Anyway, we celebrate that, the July 4th. You know, we always say the 4th of July. Well, you know, this may seem like a pedantic detail, but actually we declared our independence on July 2nd. That's when the act was passed, the resolution was passed. And then 2 days later, they promulgated the Declaration as a sort of press release to the world. This is why we're doing this. And of course, it's a great document. It does more than just say, this is why we're doing this. It lays down, you know, some of our most fundamental beliefs. But here's the thing, that getting back to George Washington, Jefferson had the words, the beautiful words, the beautiful language that we go back to again and again to sort of remind ourselves who we are. But words without deeds are just wind, you know. And Washington was the man who made it possible. One of the things I say in the book, in Land of Hope, is declaring independence was the easy part. And we're really grateful for the way we did it today. We're very grateful we did it in such an elevated way. But it really took Washington, and Washington was the indispensable man. He was the guy who made it happen and made the colonists triumph over really just impossible odds, because he held things together. He held the army together, which was at every point, through desertions, through deaths and disease and various things pulling the army apart, plus the short enlistments that the Congress would approve, which was a constant beef of Washington's. He wanted longer terms to be able to build an army, but he dealt with everything that happened, bad policies. He dealt with it all and managed to hold the army together long enough to secure a triumph. And it was a small army, it was an inexperienced army. It was up against what was arguably the most powerful military in the world, and certainly one of the most powerful armies, if not the most powerful. There's some debate about what the French army was more powerful. I would say,
yeah. Well,
no, monsieur. They just lost their empire to the British. So how? But at any rate, so we were up against terrible odds. And on the very day that independence was declared or was passed, the British landed a a large force at Staten Island with no resistance.
Well, excuse me a second. Going back, you mentioned the French army, and of course there was a scuffle, the French and Indian Wars, right? That Washington cut his teeth on, right?
That's where he begins to, develop as a military man. He has some setbacks. He was taken prisoner. He didn't. He wasn't. Although he showed the boldness that became one of his trademarks during that time, and he learned a lot about why warfare in the American situation was not like warfare in Europe, and that the way that the British regulars were trained, they were trained to fight a form of warfare that was obsolete. Americans knew how to fight, how to be sort of snipers and very fluid, what we would almost call guerrilla tactics. Guerrilla, not gorilla, guerrilla tactics. And so he was the master of deploying his army in very strategic or tactically brilliant ways. He had the smaller army, so he had to be constantly on the move, picking his targets. And the great breakthrough of the early war was, after 1776, July 4th, 1776, and the signing, the British were, they were making just almost unimpeded progress. And then came the winter, and all of the desertions and difficulties that he faced at that time. So what did he do? He put together an invasion, a surprise attack on Trenton, New Jersey, and caught the Hessians, the mercenaries, sleeping, and beat them like a drum. And then a few days later, similarly, had a victory at Princeton. So,
excuse me, I love the phrase. It says, "We value our liberties so much, we'll cross a frozen river in the dead of night on Christmas and kill you in your sleep."
Yeah, it was Christmas Day. People sometimes say Christmas Eve. It was Christmas Day. Not that really makes a big difference, but I have one of those posters. My son gave it to me. I've been thinking about putting it up in my office. But, anyway, so he there's a number. I don't want to go through the whole battle history, but there's a number of incidents in which he is he's very shrewd in the deployment of his forces. He's also an inspirational leader. He was a man. He was a big guy. He looked the way a great general should look. Broad shoulders, an impressive hunk of manhood, and on a horse. Oh my goodness! Nobody looked better on a horse than George Washington. And he was. He set an example. He was the kind of general who wouldn't ask of his men things that he wasn't willing to do for himself, including putting his life in danger. And something I am always amazed by is that he twice during, and maybe more times than we know of, he had his armies, and these were during the really bad times, at Valley Forge and before that in the winter of 76, 77, he brought in actors to portray, to enact a play about the elder Cato the Elder, the great Roman defender of the Republic, and who was a hero to the American patriots. And of course, he did not succeed. He ended up committing suicide in the play, but he was a man of such unimpeachable honor. And Washington, if you think about it, your army is disintegrating. People are freezing to death. They're having their limbs chopped off. because of gangrene. They're going back to their farms where their families are in need of them. Their enlistments run out and they get out of Dodge. This is all going on, and what he does is put on a play, and it's a play with a depressing ending. Which Joseph Addison was the author.
That's the first I heard of this. I just recently found that Martha came to visit him at Valley Forge, which I thought was tremendous. But he did this play, and
and he understood his men. You know, that these were not regulars. These guys, they were drafted off of their farms. You know, we didn't have a military, we didn't have an army, we didn't have a navy. That was part of the problem, as we were facing this very well trained army, very without a doubt the leading navy in the world, and we had none of that. But what he understood is that his men would respond to the example of honorable leadership, of leaders who were, committed to the cause of liberty, to the cause of a republican form of governance, and that they would, they would give their all. And so Cato's speeches were beautiful, and they inspired the troops. He also had Thomas Paine come out, and these are the times that try men's souls. The Sunshine Patriot. All that was all delivered to the troops to inspire them, when it did. So Washington had a feel for. He was not a great speaker himself. He wasn't bad, but he wasn't great. But he had a feeling for how important. I'm going to call it rhetoric, but it's more than that. The expression of high and noble ideas in words worthy of them. That was moving to even very common soldiers who never felt a religious vocation, but they felt a desire to bring into being this new thing, this republic. That the United States was destined to become. So Washington also he had I would even call it an intellectual side. You mentioned the Jewish Roots book that I did with Stu Halpern. One of the chief items in that is Washington's letters that he wrote as president. I'm jumping ahead here a little bit in time, but in which
to Rhode Island
describes. Yeah, pardon me.
Was that the one he wrote to?
The one in Rhode Island, Savannah, Philadelphia. We have all three of those in the book, and they have little differences. But basically, he's saying, we don't. We're not giving any sanction to bigotry, as he puts it. He shows himself to be an enemy of anti-Semitism, and this is in 1790. Right at the beginning. So the idea of religious liberty, that this was intrinsic to what we wanted to become, he grasped this from the very start. So and other things I could say, but I do want to talk about the non-military side of Washington. I mean, I should mention when he first showed up at the Second Constitutional Convention, Continental Congress, the Second Continental Congress. He showed up in his military uniform. There's no particular call for him to do that. They didn't say, "Hey, come wearing your buff and blue uniform," a very striking uniform that he had designed for himself. But that was his way of signaling, we're at a point now where we got a Fisher cut bait, and I'm with the revolution. I'm with the idea that we're going to separate from the mother country. I'm ready. I'm willing. And he understood that showing up with that uniform was his way of advertising. I'm ready to be the leader.
That's interesting. You say that. I've heard other people say he didn't wear the uniform to get the job as the general of the army, that he wore it to signify, I guess we really don't know, but that he wore it to signify that we need to go to arms, and he's prepared to go to arms. Other people have said that, it was so that he would get the job. What's your position then?
Well, either one of those things may be right. What he did was he made, and this is in a way my point about him, is that he made the action of showing up in the uniform speak louder than words, so that he could be conveying all those meanings. I think he was signifying, a kind of I'm the man, and I'm ready to do it. It's sort of like this. Remember the song "Put Me In, Coach, I'm Ready to Play." Except this is on a more exalted level. He's sort of there's nobody else in the room that has his experience.
Well, there were others that wanted the job, but they weren't. God provided George Washington. There's just no two ways about it. God provided George Washington, and I think it's evident with the attempts on his life. You talk about what a big target he was, and the Indians are saying, how could I possibly have missed him? I hit everybody around him. How did I miss him? How did we all hit him? Or miss him, rather. No,
I think really the argument for the divine favor on our country, George, where would we be without him? We could not have succeeded. And look, of course it's true, and we have to admit this at the outset. We couldn't have won the war without the French, and that may be a bitter pill for some people to swallow. It isn't for me because. Well, for one thing, they got their jollies out of it. They got to give back to their principal foe, which had just deprived them of their North American empire, humiliated them in the French and Indian War. They got to give back a little bit of woe to them in losing their colonies, their best colonies, their favorite colonies, their most prosperous colonies. Which, by the way, were the sugar colonies in the Caribbean. That's what the Brits valued the most, more than the what we think of as being the 13. But at any rate,
I don't. As far as the French are concerned, God used the wind. He used the fog. He used the rain. He could use the French. Yeah. It's just he used what was ever available to, give us this land. Yeah.
He used Cyrus, for the Jews to get them back. Yeah. So, I think Washington is so extraordinary, and he was, his extraordinary qualities were understood all over the world.
Hey, Bill, we're coming up on a hard break. Well, let's stop here and continue after the commercials, okay?
Okay.
All right, thanks. Folks, come on back after the break. Your American Heritage.
We stand for the free and the brave, for the truth our fathers gave. We live with heart, we fight with grace. This is our time, this is our place. It's not about power, it's not about fame. It's about courage that still remains. When others fall, we choose to care. That's the heritage Americans share. This is your American heritage. This is where faith, freedom, and truth still matter. This is your American heritage. Whoa.
Well, welcome back to this segment of Your American Heritage. And joining us, as he was in the last segment, is Professor Bill McClay of Hillsdale. And we're talking about things George Washington. And before you continue, Bill, I want to point out something that during the break I looked up. You mentioned Washington was taken prisoner. I'd totally forgotten that. And when I looked it up, he was taken prisoner on July 3rd of 1754. Wow, July
How about
2nd,
that?
3rd, 4th. I mean, wow.
It's a really fertile time. And of course, and your audience probably knows too, that Thomas Jefferson and John Adams both died on July 4th in 1826.
Exactly.
And then
50 years later, right?
Well, James Monroe also died on the 4th of July. So, I mean, it's a funny thing. You could take this imagine you were alive at that time in July 4th, 1826, and two of the founders, the most principal remaining founders. I mean, the last founder to die was Charles Carroll, but he wasn't as prominent as them. And what would you think? You might think, oh my gosh, this really augurs poorly for the future of the country. That on the very day that its independence was declared to the world, that they die. But that wasn't the way people read it at the time. They saw it as a sign of divine favor.
Excuse me, Bill. Bill?
And they were right.
My friend Angry Tom right now is jumping up and down saying, but I was born on the 4th of July. So,
Well, okay.
Not quite the same,
Didn't
is it?
Bruce Springsteen have a song about that?
Oh,
or
yeah.
somebody like that.
Yeah, never mind.
There you go.
But I'm sorry, I interrupted you.
Well, no, that's okay. But I mean, I wanted to make some points about Washington's political skills, which were enormous. And, he is, I'm not sure that we have anybody other than Eisenhower who had this combination of skills. That he understood that the need for a constitution that was going to be better than the Articles of Confederation, that unified the country. I mean, if you look at Washington's speeches, one of the constant themes is the need for unity. He was really worried, especially when partisan disputes between the Federalists and Jeffersonians starts to rear its head, that the country was going to come apart. In the 1790s were a really hard time for the country. That Washington was president for much of that, but by 1796, you really have the Federalist Party becoming, with Adams as the candidate, a distinct party from the Jeffersonians, and then Jefferson wins in 1800. And what was certainly one of the more divisive elections we've ever had. And it was only the second contested election in our history. And Washington died in 1799. So at that time, everybody was saying, "Oh my God, we're gone. We're sunk. We've lost our great leader that everyone who mattered, believed in and followed." But we got past that. But Washington, he incorporated into his cabinet. Well, first going back to the Constitutional Convention, the only reason, in my view, that it was a sure thing the Constitution would adopt a stronger presidency, a stronger executive than what was, the non-existent executive power under the Articles of Confederation, was because of Washington. I mean, he presided over the Constitutional Convention. He said very little, and that was kind of his way. He was a man of few words. He understood. He wasn't an intellectual, but he understood about power, how you acquire it, how you use it, and a lot of times you use it without speaking. With it being somewhat aloof, somewhat mysterious. He was a very aloof and mysterious man to a lot of the people who worked with him and admired him, because he was very attentive to the kind of impression he made on other people, and that was one of the secrets of his success. At any rate, the Constitutional Convention does produce
before
a strong
before you get
presidency
into the Constitutional Convention. I wanted to ask you a question. What was the relationship between Shays' Rebellion and Washington and the Constitutional Convention?
There's arguments about this, but I'm on the side of it being a major influence because. Will you
explain Shays? Explain it to our audience what Shays' Rebellion was about. I heard it was about one thing, and then I heard it was about property taxes. So I'm not sure.
Yeah, it's worse than that. It's foreclosures. It was a group of farmers in Western Massachusetts, many of whom that fought in the army in the Revolution, and they were paid with essentially IOUs. And they came back to their farms, and they found themselves broke. And the bankers in Boston were eager or all too willing to foreclose on them and acquire their property. And it struck them without reason as a profound injustice. And so Daniel Shays was a veteran, and he led a group to shut down the courthouse in Springfield and to prevent the court from executing foreclosures on the patriots who were going broke and losing their land. And Washington observed this, was aware of this, and said, "Look, this is a kind of thing that we can't allow to happen." He certainly had sympathy for the plight of veterans who weren't being paid, and understood that at some point they did need to be. But this was a different matter. This was violating the law. This was impeding the operation of the fundamental legal institutions. And so there's a letter he wrote to Madison about, I'm not sure whether it was Madison or Hamilton. Hamilton was certainly pushing for this, and so was Madison. And this indicates we really got to do something. There's been a lot of talk about improving the Articles of Confederation, and so the convention was actually, again, this is something else people argue about. Was there an understanding that it was really could be a redo of the American Constitution, or was it going to be just some minor improvements? I think the people who showed up at the convention knew perfectly well that a Band-Aid job wasn't going to do the trick. So, but I think Washington was on board with the idea that there needed to be all kinds of changes to bring the states into more firm presence in the Union, and to have a federal government that was powerful enough to have the power to, for example, make sure that taxes were being paid, to be able to back up policies that would require the use of force, and so on. So I think Shays' Rebellion was a key moment to get back to that, and it was in not so much in producing action from Washington, but making him agree that the time had come. And remember, he's not president at this point, but the time had come for a comprehensive rethinking of the Constitution. And of course, what ensues is, you talk about divine inspiration or divine providence. The Constitutional Convention, what an amazing collection of extraordinary individuals it was. And, I was just reading this little book about Washington I recommend to your listeners, called The Genius of George Washington by Edmund Morgan, who's an older historian now long passed away. But it's a thin book, but he makes the case that Washington was absolutely essential. To
One more time.
this,
Repeat the name of the book. Repeat the name of the book.
The Genius of George Washington.
By Morgan.
Yeah, and by Morgan. But one of the points that Morgan makes is that, there are lots of episodes in history in which people who from not so great backgrounds become extraordinary. Napoleon and so on. But Ulysses Grant, actually, is a great example of that. But what happened at the time of the founding, which you have scads of these people, you have 50 of them. For the Declaration, 55 for the Declaration. You have for the excuse me, the Constitutional Convention, the equivalent number, who have this extraordinary insight, which we know a lot about because James Madison, who was a little man, in contrast to the big man Washington, but he wrote it all down, all the discussions, and we know who was introducing what, and through that. These are people who just had such an extraordinary ability to think not only about what was right for right now, but thinking down the road 100 years or more, what's will be the consequence of doing things one way rather than another, and they had the maturity to understand that even with the growth of power in the presidency, you had to have checks on it. You had to have checks on that power, lest it be abused.
Mm-hmm.
And so, of course, Washington, everybody knew that Washington was the lead pipe cinch to be the first president. And Washington, as I've already said, is a kind of man who always thought about precedent. What kind of example am I setting by doing this? Even down to he didn't want to seem too grand in the horses and carriages that he used as president. So they had to be a little bit grand because he was a leader, but not grand in a monarchical way, not in an aristocratic way, in a Republican way. So his sense of taste was very much present in the early founding. And, of course, as we all know, his example of serving 2 terms and then bowing out was, for a long time up to Franklin Roosevelt, was the standard that everyone used, no more than 2 terms for a president. And that was not a constitutional precept. That was something came later. And so he had this sense of, I am setting an example by everything I do. So, and he was trusted with the additional power. Now, that is to say there weren't great people, great patriots who would not sign on the dotted line with the Constitution. Patrick Henry, George Mason, some really, and they foresaw some of the problems that we have had in the last 100 years as our national government has grown arguably beyond constitutional bounds, and it's one of the problems that we face, I think, in the years ahead, is how to find ways to return as much as we can to the checks and balances understanding of limited government that the founders all had, to varying degrees. But so George Washington was key in all of that, and as I mentioned in passing before, he made a point of bringing into his cabinet conflicting voices so that he would hear different arguments. And of course, the most famous conflict in the cabinet is Hamilton and Jefferson, and who had completely different conceptions of what kind of country America was going to be. Jefferson thought we would be a kind of agrarian empire and that leave the manufacturers in the world in Europe. Farming was the life that was most
Interesting.
productive of virtue.
Interestingly
farmers-
enough, he was from the South,
yeah.
and later the South was the agrarian country during the
Yes.
Civil War, and the North was the manufacturing country, right?
Well, Jefferson is a bundle of paradoxes because he was a farmer who didn't farm, and he an apostle of liberty who owned slaves and who was actually opposed to slavery. He wrote very powerful, documents throughout his life, and he wanted. Of course, he was only 33 when he wrote the Declaration, but he wanted a whole section complaining that the King of England had saddled America with this horrible institution. And, I believe it was Adams that said, no, that's not going to fly. They're not to blame.
We want South Carolina
what we've
in
done.
the Union.
Yeah. So, but it was, right. That would have never flown with South Carolina. They made it very clear that that was the Declaration, but also in the Constitution, it was very clear that the South Carolina and Georgia would not come in on a deal that would abolish slavery. So that had to be, set aside.
But there were constraints.
Unfortunately, but it did have to be.
There were constraints, though, placed on slavery with the coming of the new Constitution, right? That
yes.
Go ahead.
Within 20 years, they could vote to end the slave trade, and Jefferson was president at the time, and he didn't lose any time. He was in his last year of his second term in making sure that passed, that ended the international slave trade. It did not end slavery. It didn't. In America, the slave population increased very quickly because as bad as slavery was, it was much more favorable in America than it was in, say, Brazil, which is where most of the slave trade to the Western Hemisphere went. And the death rate, it was horrible. It was just,
hey, Bill.
And
there was the Shays Rebellion that had an influence on Washington, and then after he's president, there's the whiskey tax, the whiskey rebellion.
Yeah. Well, that's something where Washington, he didn't just say, give the command. He led the army, and that was his. And when Washington put his moral weight behind something, it got done. Now he was sparing about making that kind of show of himself, but when he didn't do it but halfway. A lot of times he used the conflicts within his cabinet to sort of, I wouldn't say hide behind them, but to wait until clarity emerged about what was the right policy. He basically was more favorable to Hamilton, who had been his aide-de-camp and whom he knew. He had a bit of a falling out with him at one point, but they reconciled. And and Hamilton's program, interestingly enough, which involved things that in retrospect are just brilliant. Taking over the debts of the states. What better way to bind the states to the Union, saying, okay, we're going to take that monkey off your back. But you will know that it was your federal government, your national government that did it. And as much as Jefferson objected to the bank and all these things, he didn't really change anything once he became president. He didn't roll back. He accepted the Hamiltonian institutions as being valid, even though he favored a strict construction of the Constitution in its own, constitutional philosophy. And that government governs best that governs least. That was a saying he liked very much. And he was an advocate for, this isn't as well known, but for a very small scale, very localized form of governance that that would de-emphasize the role of the national government in ways that we've left far behind. Although still, if you compare, I'm picking on France today, if you compare us to France, as Tocqueville did, Alexis de Tocqueville, when he came in the 1830s, or 1830, he was amazed by the fact that American government was so decentralized, that you didn't have everything coming down from Washington D.C. and unlike his own country, where going back even before the Revolution, the Bourbon kings, and particularly you think of Louis XIV. I mean, it was everything, all power emanated from that sort of central source. It was nothing like that in America, and he thought that was pretty darn good.
That was then. This is now.
Yeah, well, it is. It is. I don't know how much of a chance we have getting back to it, but I think it's worth the trying. And I would have to say this is one of the things that I don't want to make a big pitch for Hillsdale College, but anyone there who's thinking about where to send their children to college or where to go to college themselves, we really believe in the Constitution, and we inculcate that understanding in our students. And the understanding partly involves the ways that we have deviated from the Constitution, and not to our benefit. I think to our ill effect.
Yeah. Well, I'm thinking that with the decision of last year, the year before, the Supreme Court Loper-Bright decision, I'm hoping, I hope that would pull the straw out, and the whole Jenga puzzle, and the administrative state would come crashing down. But I think we have reason to believe that there's hope in that.
Oh yeah, I think it's going to take a while, and it's going to take determination that the administrative state is not worth the price we have paid for it in our own liberties, in the fundamental values that of self-government. I mean, that's a big part of what the Declaration of Independence is about. It's not just about equality, which is what people tend to emphasize.
We got 30 seconds left, Bill.
Yeah, it's about ruling ourselves. The only legitimate government is a government that proceeds from the consent of the governed.
Amen.
That's just as big.
We mutually pledge to each other our lives, our fortunes, and our sacred honor. Print it out, sign here. All right. Well, Bill, it's been good. Thanks a lot. I appreciate you joining us. You were mentioning Washington taking the troops out to take down that rebellion. I think it was just an excuse to get out of the office. But that's just me. Yeah.
Get away from the family, right?
Yeah. All right. Well, Bill, we're going to have you again sooner than next year. Okay. This has been a real hoot. I appreciate your insight.
And you're in Ann Arbor, right?
Yeah. The People's Republic of Ann Arbor.
But that's not that far away, so maybe we can swing something. Have lunch or something.
Oh, I like that idea.
All right.
Okay. Talk to you later.
Okay.
Folks, come on back for the next hour of Your American Heritage.